Hello and welcome back to Tell Me Your Ghost Story. I'm your host, Cassie Askin, and today we hear Dana's stories. Dana is a volunteer at Heritage Square Museum in Los Angeles, a reported paranormal hotspot. While volunteering on the property, Dana has had several unexplainable encounters. One note before we get into it, when Dana is talking about the photograph of him that has potentially a ghost captured in it, there was a weird audio phenomenon on the recording. I didn't hear it live and I can't explain what it is. I have never experienced this before. It's probably some kind of digital interference, but it is rather weird that I didn't hear it live. The audio phenomenon actually went on for much longer, and I had to cut some sections out just so that section is actually listenable. It's pretty weird. I don't know if I can call it paranormal. Maybe it is. It's a bit weird that it happened only when he was talking about a potential ghost that showed itself on another form of media in a picture. But that's just a warning. There will be a second of buzzy static during that bit. So without any further ado, let's get to Dana's stories. Hi, Dana.
Hey,
Thank you so much for coming on to tell us your ghost story today. Can you give us some history on Heritage Square and explain what it is that you do there?
sure. Heritage Square is a museum here in Southern California that started in 1969, and it was put together to save historic buildings in the Southern California area. So they got this kind of out of the way piece of land, and they specifically wanted to save two buildings at that point that were old homes from the well known Bunker Hill part of Los Angeles. And those two homes were moved there in 1969 and getting ready to be restored and the whole process starting. But they kind of sat there untended for a few months. And unfortunately, both the homes were burned down later in 1969. So those two homes were lost that were originally supposed to start Heritage Square. And that was a huge blow. But it didn't stop the founders and the city from moving forward. So they had more buildings moved there in subsequent years. And so now there's actually eight buildings, homes, and other buildings there at Heritage Square. And so they've had success in getting them moved there, and they're continually restoring them. They're open for tours, they do special events, and they do neat stuff there. And it's become quite popular for people to go there. And a lot of it is because the popularity of paranormal things in recent years have become pretty big. And so the museum tends to push those events because they're always trying to raise money to keep the place going, of course. So you need to find events that will bring people in to the museum. So they focus a lot in the last 5 years on paranormal events. So because of that, it's kind of kept the museum going in better health than they did in prior years. Hence a lot of attention from television shows, etc. And so I've been a volunteer there for about 12 years. I've always been interested in old homes, history of Los Angeles. And so I visited Heritage Square before I was a volunteer, and I really loved the place. And I thought, I want to get involved here in some way. And so I found out that they do training, or used to do training on a 6 month basis to be a volunteer there. So I signed up and went through the training and enjoyed it all. And then immediately I started doing tours. And so over the last 12 years, I've done hundreds of tours there, gotten to know the buildings quite well. I've been in all of them. I've done some restoration on some of them, helping a friend of mine. Been there alone by myself at times in the houses. And I know the buildings quite well, doing my own research on their histories, and I'm just being there a lot for different events and normal tours. And it's been a real wonderful thing for me to be part of. I've made many friends there, and it's just a neat place for me to go to help out and enjoy my time in these old buildings, lead my tours, lead special events, and just get to know the place much deeper and much more in depth.
So let's get into the spooky side of
Sure.
Heritage Square. Heritage Square is a hotspot for paranormal activity. There have been two televised paranormal investigations of the property: the Osbourne's Night of Terror in 2020 and Ghost Adventures in 2023. The narrative from those two investigations is that each of the houses has its own dark, tumultuous, sad history. Its inhabitants were plagued with mental illness, and there have been many deaths inside of each of the houses. And that pain and anguish has marked the houses and stayed within the walls. Do you agree with that characterization of the haunting, or have your experiences brought you to a different understanding of whatever it is that's happening on the property?
I would say I partially agree with that. Like the spiel about many deaths in the houses. I don't know that we've actually recorded many specific deaths that occurred in homes. Of course, often make people die in hospitals. So that's iffy, you know. And I don't know that anyone's done a specific search on each home to see what deaths may have occurred there. So that's again very iffy. Now, obviously, they are old buildings. They're all well over 100 years old, except for one building they built about 10 years ago. That's a replica building. So we'll kind of leave that out of that. But otherwise, most of the buildings or all the buildings are over 120 years old at least. So they have a lot of history. A lot of people have lived in them. A lot of things have happened in them. They've been moved to get to Heritage Square, and some have been moved more than once. So a lot of things have occurred in them. And when you have a lot of things occurring and a lot of people living in there, there's obviously more chance for things to remain in those buildings.
And you were a part of the Osborne special. You were part of their like
I actually
round
was.
table where a few volunteers and employees of Heritage Square all told their experiences. Can you tell us about the experience of when they were actually filming that special? And do you have any behind the scenes stories about when that was filming?
A little bit. I remember it was occurring during COVID, first of all. So remember, we had to come there and we had to wear masks at first. And then I believe they tested all of us. And if we all were negative, they let us take the masks off since we were going to stay in a group and they thought it would be okay to go ahead, which we did. And then I remember we met in the church at Heritage Square because it's like a big area where everyone could kind of get together and talk. And they actually started the filming in the church, as I recall. And they kind of asked each of our opinions about the museum, if we thought it was haunted, and if so, which building we all thought was the most haunted. And of course, I remember I said the Octagon Home, which is the Longfellow Hastings house. And that's what I said. I felt that was the most haunted of all the buildings at Heritage Square. Other than that, I don't know that I was on camera anymore. We kind of tagged around with a lot of them that day as they were filming different things. I remember I talked to the Osborne daughter, I can't think of her name, and she was there with her little dog a lot, and we kind of buddied around with her, and it was kind of fun. And I remember she was very scared to be there with what has been said about Heritage Square. And I remember they did filming. There was also a gentleman there who's a ghost hunter, and I unfortunately can't think of his name, but he has been on many shows. He's actually done ghost events at Heritage Square before, and he was there and kind of warning the Osbournes that, do you know the history of this place, and do you know what you're getting into based on the history of what's occurred at Heritage Square? And they kind of said, yeah, kind of. And, that was kind of building up the tensity for the evening. And so that's about what I can say. Obviously, they filmed the episode. We were just kind of used in the beginning and gave our opinions. And that was kind of where our place was.
Now, let's get into your personal experiences that you've had on the property. Can you tell us any and all experiences you've had?
I've had a lot of people come through Heritage Square. And again, there's numerous buildings. And I've had people mention various buildings. I've been to ghost hunts at all or many of the buildings before, so you've had various things. Um, but it always comes down to what they feel, and the consensus is the most haunted building there, and it always comes out to be the Octagon Home, which is formerly called the Longfellow Hastings Octagon House. It always gets back to that house. And that is also the house where I've had my own personal experiences. I've had people talk about other houses. Many times, my guests on my tours would comment on certain houses. They talked about the Shaw House once, which is another house there. I had a medium on my tour, and she talked about she felt that there was something on the second floor of that home. And she said, "What's up there?" I said, "Well, they were bedrooms." And she said she felt something in the back rear room on the first floor, but again, the focus was on the room above that. I said, "Well, that's interesting because that's actually one of the um, employees' offices." So I didn't want to tell her what she felt. And she said about that room that she said that room needs to be blessed. And I said, "Okay, that's interesting. I won't tell the girl again whose office that is, but I'll tell someone about that." So remember she mentioned that about that, the Shaw House. But again, always, most of the comments deal with the Octagon House. And as I said, all my in depth experiences have occurred in or near the Octagon House. And if you want to, I'll give you some history about that house because it's a very unique house, especially in California and also in the United States. Now, the history of the Octagon goes way back to 1848 and a book that was written by a man named Orson S. Fowler. His book was called The Octagon House, A Home for All. And he was the first man that pushed the idea of building octagon homes or buildings. He felt that they were better ventilated, they were easier to heat and easier to cool, that they maximized usable space, that they were sunny and comfortable to live in, and cheaper to build than a typical four-sided house. Now, the floor plan of those octagon homes is typically, again, it's an octagon shape, but in those corner spaces are usually closets or spare rooms to take up and make up those odd shapes, which the corners would normally leave a room to be very, very strange. So, in between, you usually have a square shape, then those corners again are closets or spare rooms, and that's what makes the overall octagon shape work. Now, not many of these homes were ever built, especially in the western United States and particularly in California. Now, they think that maybe 20 were ever built in California, and last I heard, they thought that maybe 5 of them remained. But they said this one at Heritage Square is the only unaltered Octagon home that still stands in the state of California. Now, and even this house, though, has gone through much history in its history in since it was built. It was actually first built in 1893 on a 10-acre parcel of farmland on San Pasqual Street here in Pasadena, which is a well-known town, of course, here in Southern California, by a man named Gilbert Longfellow. Now, Mr. Longfellow was originally born in 1824 in Maine, married his first cousin, Hannah Stetson Longfellow, and he held vast amounts of land in Maine, and he owned a lumber mill as well. Now, Mr. Longfellow read Orson Fowler's book about Octagon homes, and he felt that an Octagon home would suit his needs perfectly there in Maine. So he first built an Octagon in Maine in 1868 in a town called Rogue Bluff. He raised 7 children there. They lived there in the Octagon home. And by the way, that Octagon home still stands in Maine also. But living there, he went through many personal tragedies. And they believe it was probably from much of the family catching tuberculosis. He even lost his wife, Hannah, in 1889. And because of those tragedies, it pushed Mr. Longfellow to relocate. And he actually moved out here to Southern California because he felt it was a warmer climate and cleaner air, and that's what brought the family to Pasadena. So, there in Pasadena, he built his second Octagon, which was a much larger version than the home they'd had in Maine. And he even built a doghouse in that same Octagon shape because of his love of the design. I don't know what happened to the doghouse. I've never seen that, but apparently there was one at one time. And the Pasadena farm also contained orange and lemon groves on their acreage. Now, after Gilbert's death in 1912, his son, Charles Longfellow, had the house moved in 1917 to a city lot about a mile north of the farm at 85 South Allen Avenue, again in Pasadena, using horsepower, capstan winches, and wooden rollers. Now, the original farm was actually subdivided, and that became Caltech, which still, of course, is in Pasadena. But interesting, and there's some linoleum in the house, which is at Heritage Square, and that linoleum, which you'll see in some of the rooms, dates to the time of the move. Apparently, they somewhat upgrade the house and actually put linoleum in, and that was the way they kind of fixed up the house in 1917. Now, Walter Hastings, and he was Gilbert Longfellow's grandson, lived the majority of his life in this Octagon home, and he wished to see it restored and preserved as an example of the rare Octagon architecture of the 19th century. Now, in 1973, when the house was first threatened with demolition, the Cultural Heritage Foundation helped him protect the home and save it from demolition, which of course was fantastic. Now, in return, Walter promised the house to Heritage Square when he was ready to move out of it. Finally, up in 1986, when he was 85, Walter decided to relocate to Stockton, California, to live with his niece. And so he sold the land that it was on, and the buyer agreed to allow time for the house to be moved to Heritage Square Museum. Now, the Pasadena Heritage kind of fought to keep the home in Pasadena at that point due to its historical significance. But because Walter had already promised the home to Heritage Square, the move was made per his request. Now, the house was actually moved to Heritage Square starting on October 13th, 1986, in one piece with only the roof removed. Now, because of its size and the difficult route it had to take, it actually took 2 nights to complete the move. After the first night, the house sat on an empty lot in South Pasadena before continuing its slow journey to its new home at Heritage Square. Moving the house to Heritage Square cost $85,000. And of course, this is about 40 years ago. Of course, now it doesn't seem like much, but then it was quite a bit of money. And the cost of the new foundation and cupola restoration was another $12,000. Re-roofing, interior and exterior structural work, including a veranda that was built, cost another $135,000, with the veranda restoration being completed in 2009. After that, they had a dedication ceremony at the museum in March 2009, with many surviving Hastings family members attending that ceremony. Now, this house, which again is an 8-sided building, has been listed on the National Register of Historic Places since March 2nd, 1982, and again is the only surviving unaltered 19th century octagon in the state of California and gives an outstanding example of Orson Fowler's innovative and daring ideas. Now, in terms of my own experience, I've been volunteering at Heritage Square for about 12 years, so I again have done hundreds of homes through the Octagon. And as part of being at Heritage Square, I've also been parts of different ghost events on my own time that involve the Octagon home. Now, and some things I've heard about the home, which don't necessarily involve me, but are interesting, that the house is actually written up on a book on Southern California haunting, where it mentions a ghost hunt held there a few years ago, where a girl had a brand new shoulder strap purse broken off of her while she was in the house. And mediums at that event felt that the most haunted parts of the house are the bedrooms on the second floor, the bathroom with the tub on the first floor, and a dark alcove underneath the staircase on the first floor. And these have all been mentioned repeatedly when I've been in the house, with often guests on my tours feeling uneasy in that same alcove area near the staircase, including another docent at the museum who mentioned she never liked going in that part of the house. Now, I actually had a person on my tour, and this is about 5 years ago, and she actually felt that there was an old woman that lived there in that alcove, and she felt her name was Nora. And they also felt that there was a young girl in the dining room area of the house, and that part of the house will come up later in my stories. And remember the dining room area. I also had a medium once, and she was actually walking outside the house with me, and was looking up at the house, and she was pointing to one of the windows, which is actually off the men's dressing room on the second floor of the house. And she said that there was a woman that watches out the window of the closet next to the men's dressing room and watches people walk by. Now, another guest told me that yes, she felt there were spirits in the house, but she felt that they were all well meaning and just like to play tricks on people who were in the home. Now, there's another thing I was going to mention to you before I actually get into my stories, but something which does involve me. I was in the house not too long after I first started volunteering there, and we were doing what was called our morning tours. And that was a Halloween event where we had different displays set up in various homes at Heritage Square. And on that first event, I was actually in the Octagon House, interesting enough. And so I was dressed in my Victorian clothing to look the part of a Victorian man in the home. And I was actually out in the dining room of the house again, talking to another docent, and she's pointing to me, telling me something. And behind me is a wall of the dining room, which will come into play somewhat later in my stories. And I notice, and this is several years later, I noticed this on the right lower corner of that photograph, there's this kind of fuzzy looking um, figure about 2 feet high. And what you see, you can kind of see through it, but it looks like the bottom of a woman's dress. And you look at it, you go, what is that? Because it's funny because you only see her about the 2 feet of her. And again, it looks like a dress kind of touching the floor. And it only goes about 2 feet. Above that, you see the door behind her because she doesn't show up above that 2 feet. You see the wall behind her, again, which is the door to the pantry. But only on the floor, down near the floor, you see what looks to be a woman's long skirt standing there, maybe listening to us as we were talking near her. Behind me, actually, she appears as I'm talking to that other docent there in the dining room. So when I first saw that picture, I'm going, what is that? And I kept looking at it thinking, how did I never notice this? Because when I look at it now, and I dug it up and I found it on my computer, I thought, there it is. And you look at it, you go, what is that form that only comes about 2 feet up, but looks to be a woman in an old Victorian skirt standing there, maybe listening to us or watching us in that dining room of the Octagon House? So, when I was doing research for this talk today, I found I had another experience there, which I'd kind of forgotten about, but I used to talk about on my tours. And I'm going, oh, that's right. I had that experience there too. And I'll start with that one. Now, this was back in 2017 while I was conducting a tour in the Octagon. And I was actually in that aforesaid dining room. And in the dining room, there's a cupboard on one side of the wall. And again, you'll see it in the photograph. There's a cupboard with some doors, and behind that cupboard is the pantry, which is the room behind it. And normally on my tour, I stand there and my group is around me, and I talk about the cupboards of the pantry and that lead into the pantry. And I show them how the pantry door has to be opened. You have to turn a little knob to unlatch it, and the pantry door opens. It's a neat little feature of the room. So, of course, I showed off my tour. So on that day, I was standing there talking about the pantry doors on my tour, and I turned around to face the doors to open them, and I'm reaching towards the door, and my hand gets about 6 inches from grabbing that little knob when all of a sudden the door unlatches itself and opens by itself. And I go, of course, what do you say? I go, oh, the door opened by itself. Because I didn't know what else to say. And I just kind of stood there going, well, that's never happened before. And I want to say that, and people have asked about this, the doors can't just open by themselves, like in the wind or a breeze or whatever. You have to grab the latch, click it, and unlatch them to then release the door to open. So, wind or anything like that, or anything just moving by themselves, they cannot open like that. They have to be physically turned and opened by something. So that's the first thing that happened to me personally in that house. Now, I will say, when I was on one of those previous ghost tours, I was in the house. Again, I was standing in the kitchen, and they said to us at that time, don't go in the bathroom on the first floor because people in the bathroom, they said, often feel touched on their back or pushed. And so at that point, that hadn't happened to me. But they were doing EVPs that night when we were there, and they were having us ask questions of what we wanted to ask the spirits or whoever was living in the house. And so twice I said my name. I said, "What's my name?" And of course, I didn't hear anything, but later they played it back for us. And then I also at one point said, "Mr. Hastings." That was the last member of the Longfellow family, Mr. Hastings. "Are you here?" And of course, at that point, didn't hear anything. But then later they played back the tape for us, and I heard myself say, um, when I said, "What's my name?" And we could hear on the tape it said Dana a couple times. It said Dana, my name, and of course that was kind of freaky. And then when I had said, "Mr. Hastings, that you here?" There was a big kind of clap sound, and so obviously there was some kind of response to me saying, "Mr. Hastings, is that you? Are you still here?" So that was another experience I'd had in the house. But they don't compare to my big experience in the house. And that's what I've kind of saved for last. And this I actually wrote down the date because I want to remember when it occurred. It was actually January of 2019. And again, I was doing a tour and I was in the Octagon House. And it's usually quite a ways through my tour. You start at one of the earlier houses, get the Octagon, you have a couple more to go after that, and then you're done. So you're kind of in your way. You've done a good tour and it's going well, and you're in the Octagon House, but you always know that this is the house that people talk about the most. And it also gets the most questions because people that come to the museum usually often have heard about this house and the stories about this house. So, anyway, I was most of the way through my tour in the Octagon House, and I was actually standing in the back of the parlor. Now, in the parlor, which is kind of living room, it's set up and there's furniture there that has been placed there to get the look of an occupied parlor. And there's kind of a little corner cupboard in that room, which is like a triangle. It's a cupboard in a triangle shape in a corner of the room. And I was standing by that, talking to my tours. And my tour were out in front of me, and I probably had like 12 people on both sides of the room looking at me. Well, I'm looking because I'm in the back of the parlor. I'm looking across the room, and at the back of the room is a large open doorway that looks straight into the dining room, and it's open. There's no doors there. So I was looking straight through the parlor into the dining room, and I could see the dining room ahead of me. So again, I'm talking, and what I could also see, there's a door that opens between the front hall into the dining room. That door was open that day, and I could see the edge of that door in my line of sight in the dining room. So again, I'm talking about the parlor, but mostly looking at the dining room because it's straight ahead of me and it's open. As I'm standing there, all of a sudden, I see a leg kick out from behind that dining room open door from the entry hall and kick up in the air and then kind of kick back behind that same door. And I immediately stop talking as my brain is going, "What did you just see? What did you just see?" And so immediately, again, I'd stop talking, but I wanted over there and look behind the door. So I walked across the parlor, through the doorway into the dining room, immediately looked around the back of that door that's from the entry hall in the dining room. And of course, there was nothing there when I looked. And I turned around the people and I said, "I think I just saw a ghost." Because I told him I saw a leg kick out from behind the door, and one of the guests told me that he had seen it too. Apparently, he had been turning a little bit sideways and not directly facing me, so he saw the leg come out that I had seen looking beyond them into the dining room. Now, let me describe what it looked like to you. First of all, it wasn't a solid form. It was kinda shadowy. I could kinda see through it. So again, it was like a well, I don't wanna call it ghost shape, but that term kinda fits, unfortunately. I could see through it somewhat. I got the impression of a long boot on the leg, like people would wear in the 19th century, of course. And I also got the impression of trousers above that. So again, my guess is it was a man's leg, of course, because it kind of fits. So at that point, I was thinking to myself, I think I've seen a ghost. I had no reason to doubt it. I immediately had gone over and checked, and there was no physical being behind that door. And I wasn't drunk. I hadn't taken anything that day to make me see things except on my own 2 eyes. And also based on the fact that that one guest said he had seen it too, made me believe that I had truthfully, for the first time in my life, seen a real ghost. And it was in that infamous and again, like I said, of all the buildings at Heritage Square, that is the one that everyone talks about, and that's where I saw my ghost.
Huge thank you to Dana for sharing his stories. You can find his ghost picture on the Tell Me Your Ghost Story Instagram. To plan a visit to Heritage Square, head to heritagesquare.org. Please like, rate, review, subscribe, follow the pod wherever you consume it. Follow us on Instagram for photos from the show at Tell Me Your Ghost Story Podcast. And if you're listening to audio only, the video portion is available over on YouTube, and we got some fun stuff going on over on TikTok at Tell Me Your Ghost Story Pod. If you have a true paranormal story you'd like to share, please email it to tellmeyourghoststorypodcast at gmail.com. Until next week, my friends, good night to all, and to all a good night. Bye.